Welcome to MyLife, Tanya Applied, with Rabbi Simon Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good tevach, a good week. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer HaTanya. This program is made possible by Rena Lights LLC, and it is in honor and memory of Yosef Halevi Weinberg Olav Hashalom, Rabbi Moshe Pinchas HaKoyen Katz Olav Hashalom, Rabbi Yoel HaKoyen Khan Olav Hashalom, and it's in schus and merit of Rab Zev Yecheskel HaKoyen and Risha Katz. La'erich Yomim V'shanim Tevis, for many long, healthy years. We finished the 5th Perek of Tanya, Kadisha. We're now about to enter the 6th Perek. So, a small summary and then an introduction, and we shall enter the new Perek, the new chapter 6. In this organized and fascinatingly organized structure of really telling us about what makes us tick, what are the forces that define your very being, the very psyche, the Alter Rebbe structured it, that in chapter 1, after the introduction of all the different questions he asked about tzaddikim, beinim, reshoyim, began that there are two souls. There are two forces, two voices within us. At the end of chapter 1, he began, the first is the animal soul, the nefesh habamis, the klipa and sitra achra, which means it's a soul that is dressed up in garments. And we say garments, we mean like in a container, in a klipa, in a husk, that allows it to enter this material world, and its main focus is self-interest. And from there derives the different characteristics, what he called the Yesodus Haroim, the negative characteristics of a personality of a person. It's not complete evil, like Shalosh Klipos Atmeis, as we discussed then at the end of chapter 1. So it has divine energy, but the divine energy is masked, is camouflaged, is concealed within the klipa, within the husk. And that is the first soul. Then comes in chapter 2 the second soul, Nefesh HaShenis B'Yisrael, which is a chelik elekam emal mamash, called the Nefesh HaLekis, the divine soul. This one is openly and blatantly divine. The animal soul is also a divine source, but it's the divine as already packaged, so to speak. Just as we say, for example, that when you eat a piece of food, there's a spark of the divine. Moitzi pi havaya. Not bread alone, le'al lechem levadei yichya adam. But it's manifest, it's malubash. It's dressed up and clothed. And even being held hostage, you can say, in the material food, the material bread. Whereas the divine soul is unadulterated, pure divinity. It will have to contend with an animal soul, but on its own, it's pure divinity, as he explained in chapter 2. Then chapters 3, 4, and 5 all discuss the dynamics, the anatomy of the divine soul. Firstly, in chapter 3, the faculties of the divine soul, the cognitive and the emotional faculties that are completely involved in and consumed with divine consciousness, contemplating on the divine, emotional feelings, love, reverence. Chapter 4 and 5 about the garments, the 3 garments of expression, which in the case of the divine soul are also divine expression. In many ways, those garments actually elevate and are even higher than the very faculties and the soul itself of the nefesh, ruach, neshama, because now we're bringing Torah mitzvahs into the picture. And the Torah mitzvahs, which a person does with thought, speech, and action, connects that soul, as we discussed, the soul embracing God and also internalizing the divine in a yichud nifla, as he explains in chapter 5, through learning Torah. So now we've covered the divine soul in chapters 2, 3, and 4, and 5. Now in chapter 6, he's going to go back to the second half of chapter 1. Let's talk about now the anatomy of the animal soul. We only discussed so far the very nature of it. In other words, the equivalent of chapter 2 for the divine soul was the end of chapter 1 for the animal soul. but we didn't discuss its faculties and its garments. In other words, its makeup, its architecture. And now we're going to learn about the architecture, the structure of the animal soul. Why is this so important? Because this is what we need to contend with. This is the battle of our lives. And we're going to get back after chapter 6, 7, and 8. Also 3 chapters dedicated. So in a sense you could say like 3, 4, 5 are dedicated to the faculties and the garments of the divine soul, with chapter 2 being about the soul itself. The second half of chapter 1 is the soul itself. 6, 7, and 8 is about the anatomy of the animal soul. Then he's going to go back in chapter 9 and now pit them together, pit them one against the other. That we have an equal battle now between two forces. One is absorbed with self-consciousness and self-survival, the animal soul, and one is absorbed and consumed with transcendence, connecting to something higher than itself, the divine soul, as we shall learn later. So now we need to understand the second half. So even though it's interesting, the Alter Rebbe began first with the animal soul and then went to the divine soul, but the details of the divine soul come before the details of the animal soul. Perhaps the reason for that is to give us a fighting chance. So he wants to begin with the real power of the divine soul. So in actuality, it says in different commentaries on Tanya, the animal soul comes in first inside the human being. It's only at Bar Mitzvah and Bas Mitzvah where the divine soul begins to manifest. Even though, of course, a person is born with a divine soul, but its manifestation is later. Agdem et Tainisa, it says, that first comes the animal soul to give it a fighting chance. But when the Alter Rebbe goes into the details, he details the divine soul, Mashbiya Nesei, consistent with the first opening line of Tanya, that the soul is given an oath and is sated, is empowered with the resources to be a tzaddik and not to be a wicked person. That means to let the divine soul dominate and not the animal soul, as we shall learn later in Tanya. So now we go into chapter 6. And as we'll see, literally corresponds to the divine soul, and he begins and explains why. So Perek Vov, let's learn together. V'hinei, and now, Zeh l'uma zeh osa l'kim. He cites a pasuk, the basis of a pasuk in Kehelis in Ecclesiastes Zayin Yudalit 7:14. And what does it say there? Zeh l'uma zeh osa l'kim. Now God has made one opposite the other, like two parallel words. Zeh l'uma zeh. So zeh would be the world of holiness and kedusha, and l'uma zeh, you have literally a mirror image in a different world that corresponds and is opposite the other, but it corresponds to it. It has everything the other has, but in the world of not kedusha, the world of klippa, as we shall learn, the world of sitra achre, the other side, which also the other side of what? Because the first side is holiness, and the other side. So you have now two equal forces. That's how the Alter Rebbe begins chapter 6, which in itself is already a tremendous lesson in life. To know that you have two forces at work, which is the basis of free will, because without that, if one was stronger than the other, if one was more powerful than the other, if one had more resources than the other, you wouldn't have an equal battle. And the point is to have these two forces. Of course, with the goal of the divine soul dominating and harnessing and channeling and subduing and all the different expressions you can use, the animal soul, which we shall learn later. So right now, so God has made one opposite the other. And he spells out what that means. Ki kamoy shenefesh alekis, klula me'eses sfiras kadeshes. For just as the divine soul is comprised of the 10 holy spheres, as we learned in chapter 2, in chapter 3 I should say, that the Nefesh Alikis is comprised of 10 holy spheres, which nishtal shulamahem into the 10 faculties of the soul, umislabeshes b'shleish levushim g'deishim. That was chapter 3. In chapters 4 and 5, and it manifests in, and dressed and clothed in 3 holy garments, Because remember, in divine soul, it's all holy. So it's Esser Spheres Gdeshes, the spheres, the very faculties which comprise of the very building blocks of the divine soul, are encompassed and are comprised of the 10 spheres, which are the 10 faculties, divine faculties. And Mislabeshes, that's already like a garment. It's not the very building blocks. It's not like the limbs and organs of the soul, but it's the garments that which the soul manifests in. The thought, speech, and action of Torah and mitzvahs, as we learned in chapter 4, of thought, speech, and action. So just as it is, now we took the Zelumazeh, that's on the side of Kedusha, the animal, the divine soul. So too with the animal soul. Koch, hanefesh de sitra achra. So too this nefesh of the other side, which is the expression used in Zohar, without saying, in a very Lashon Nikiyah, very pure and edel, refined way, saying the other side that is not the side of holiness. Koch, he says, hanefesh de sitra achra, the soul that comes from the other side, as he explained in the end of chapter 1, the one that is coming from the divine energy, but as it manifests in the I don't want to use the word garments, not to confuse it with the levushim here, but it's the same idea. It dresses itself up in the husks of the material world that conceal the divine nature of the divinity of that energy. So too this animal soul, the nefesh habamis, he calls it now the nefesh of sitra achra. Sometimes he uses the word animal souls. Here's the nefesh of sitra achra, because he wants to say sitra, the other side of Kedusha. If Kedusha is here, what's on the other side? What's the parallel universe? He says, so too, the animal soul has a similar structure, a similar architecture, Kacha nefesh the sitra achra, which comes from klipas nega. The sitra achra, which comes from klipas nega, that we explained. What's klipas nega? Klipas nega is the transparent, or you can say the bright klippa. Why? Because it's more like like the peel of a grape, or the peel of an olive, which is a peel. So there's still the fruit within it. Is the divine within it, but it's a peel. For example, a nut, especially a coconut, and with a very thick membrane, a thick husk, is a different type of klippa kosher. This is called a klippa raka. Klippa kosher means a hard shell. This is a soft shell. So it's klippas nega because the light still shines through, because it could be elevated, as we'll learn later in Tanya. It could be elevated to holiness. But right now, it's a concealer. Think of everything in this material world is that way. Like I said before about food, the same thing is about your table, your chair, everything, your work. It's neutral, but the divine is concealed in it, in contrast to real Kedusha. It's like Divrei Reshus. It's neutral in that sense. So also this nefesh, the sitra achra, which comes from the other side, which is what? Focused on self-serving, self-interest of the divine, of the animal soul's need for survival, which comes from Miklipas Nega. That klippa is explained at the end of chapter 1. Hamalubeshes bedama odam, as he also explained at the end of chapter 1. So here we have three expressions. It's the sitra achre, which comes from the klipas nega, the nefesh of the other side, that comes from the klipas nega, from the klippa, the husk, that conceals the divine within. Hamalubeshes bedama odam, as we learned, that where is it manifest inside the human being? It's in the blood. The Dama Adam, in the blood of the person, that's where it's present, that's where it dwells, as we'll learn more in detail in chapter 9 later. That the Nefesh Alikis dwells primarily in the mind, and the animal soul primarily in the heart, in the blood, which is passionate and impulsive, the emotions. It's driven primarily by emotions, by impulses, as we're going to discuss shortly in the continuing of this chapter. So this is he's all defining the soul. He hasn't yet finished the sentence. He's saying, just as it is with the divine soul, which is comprised of the 10 holy spheres and the 3 holy garments, So to the animal soul, which comes from the other side, which comes from Klippas Nega, which is manifest and dressed and clothed in the blood. So here too, Klula, and now comes the other phrase, other end of the sentence, Klula me'eser kisrin de misavusa. Just like we said before, Klula, it's encompassed of the 10 holy spheres and the divine soul. Now it's encompassed of the 10 crowns of impurity. Misavusa is an expression from Zohar, from the word impure, like Tuma. In Zohar, Cheli Gimel, Mem Aleph Beis, that's where it talks about it. Kisrin de Misavusa. Misavusa means a Tuma. Why are they called Kisrin? Why before he called them Spheres? Because when it comes to Klippa, explains the Rebbe Rashab, and this piece in Tanya, the energy, the divine energy, is removed somewhat. A kesed is a makif. A kesed is a crown that's on top of your head. When you say the Spheres, there is the Eiris and Kalim, the divine energy and the divine containers. Or in the context of faculties, it's divine attributes in divine faculties of Meichen and Midas. When it comes to Klippa, because the Klippa dominates and the husk, so the energy within is so-called removed from the consciousness. So when we're involved in materialism, unless you make an effort, a concerted and exerted effort, to elevate and direct your activities toward L'Shem Shamayim, toward the divine, on its own, it remains somewhat removed from the divine. So that's why it's called Kisrin. Crowns of impurity. So now the same thing, just as that divine soul is encompassed of 10 holy spheres, here we're talking about what's the mirror image, the parallel in the Umazeh, in the other side, that it's encompassed of the 10 crowns of impurity. The crowns of impurity is the Umazeh of the holy 10 spheres. So it's also 10. It's also 10 faculties. But these faculties have already an agenda. Their agenda is self-preservation. Their agenda is survival. Their agenda is self-interest. The self-interest of the animal soul. So he's taking the same language that he used in the end of chapter 1, but now he's adding the building blocks. What are the components? So just as the divine soul has 10 components, or 10 building blocks, or 10 pieces, 10 limbs if you wish, 10 components, so too it is it with the animal soul. The Eser Kisrin de Misavusa. Shehain, he continues, and what are these 10? So just like in the beginning of chapter 3 in Tanya, what did he say? He said that there are 10 spheres. He says, Mishtalshel Mehem, and from them evolved the 10 faculties, the divine faculties of the divine soul. And what did he say? That breaks down into 2 parts. Seichel and Midas. So here too, exactly the same idea. The 10 crowns of impurity, Shehain, Sheva Midas Rois. What are these 10? They consist of the 10 Sheva Midas Rois. They consist of the emotions, the negative emotional faculties or powers. Habois ma'arba Yuseidus Roim, which originate or are sourced or emanate from the 4 negative elements, Haniskarim Le'il, as it was mentioned above, where the end of chapter 1. Again, the chapter 1 flows right into chapter 6 in this context. That what? That it comprised of that because those midas, the midas rois, which means the negative emotions of a person, whatever they may be, chesed, a love, but it's used in a negative way. Gvura, anger. Where does it originate from? We learned they come from the 4 negative elements. The 4 archetypes of Eish, Mayim, Ruach, Ofar, of fire, a water, air, and earth. And he explained there how each one corresponds with and as the root of different type of negative characteristics. Just to refresh our memory, let's just go back there for a moment at the end of chapter 1. So what does he say? He went through the four. Let's be brief about it. We'll just be brief. He says, Kas v'gaiva, anger and pomposity and arrogance, from Yeseda Eish, from fire, the Taivas and Tanugim, the desires and the pleasures, from Mayim, water, Hailulus v'letzonas v'Ispirus, which is silliness, mockery, boasting, is from Ruach. And finally, Atzlus v'Atzvus, which is laziness and depression, from Ofar, from earth. So that's what he said there, comes from those Daled Yesedus. So the 7 negative emotions, which is the first of the 10. Why does he say first? We'll get to that shortly. He starts here with the Midas and then goes to the Meichin. Remember, it's 10. 10 crowns of impurity. But now he started first with the 7 Midas, which come from the 4 Yesedus. So again, linking it to the end of chapter 1. He says, and then that's the Seichel HaMelidon. And the mind, or the intellect, which gives birth, which produces these emotions. And what is the mind? The mind, Hanechlak L'Sholish, divides into 3, Shein Chochma Bina V'das, which is Chochma Bina V'das. So exactly as it was the divine soul. The divine soul is made up of 10 holy spheres that break down and divide into mind and emotions. Here he just reverses the order, which we'll explain in a moment. It's already obvious why. He starts with the 7 negative emotions, and the mind that gives birth to them or produces them, that divides into 3. Chachma Bina Das. So there you have the 10 impure crowns of the animal soul, which are the Mokir Hamidus, the source of the emotions, which I'll explain shortly after this. Right after that, I'll explain what that means. But let's first address, why did he reverse the order? If it's Zelu Mazeh, shouldn't it be exactly the same? And the answer really will be understood when we learn chapter 9, but it's also quite clear. When it comes to the divine soul, it's driven by purpose. It's driven by a deliberate design. It's not driven by impulses. Even though the divine soul naturally has a natural love to God that we're going to learn about later, but the primary activity and its behavior is very deliberate and reflective. In chapter 9, he's going to explain, because the Nefesh HaLekis resides in the mind. It begins always, not just whatever you want to do, whatever you like. It's a reflective mind. So Moichin gives birth to Midas, as he explained there. And the primary thing is the Midas that are given birth to from the mind's contemplation about God. What about the Midas that are natural to the divine soul? So that too is also a result of a higher level of intellect as well. But either way, the bottom line is, as far as Avedis Ha'adam goes, the work of the divine soul begins with the mind. In the animal soul, the opposite is true. It begins with impulse. When we have desires, whatever it may be, a person gets angry, a person has taivas, the different things, arrogance, mockery, or all the different things that we just mentioned, and many others, whether it's chesed all the way to malchus, the 7 negative emotions, these, unfortunately, come easy to us in this world. That's the way God made it. It's impulsive. You need work to control it. Moyach shalat al-lev, as we're going to learn later in Tanya. Mind over matter, the mind controlling the emotions. But primarily the animal soul is driven by like an animal. An animal doesn't have to contemplate it. It has a certain impulsive, you can say behavioral, a reflexive behavior. And therefore that's why it begins first with emotions. However, it's not void of seichel. The seichel is also there because we see b'poel, we see in actuality. Even when an animal soul is pursuing its own desire, and that's its driving force, it also uses its mind to appreciate that desire, or to figure out a strategy to get that desire fulfilled. Even in a real, actual animal, and here we're talking about a human being, you have what's called seichel hanikna. There's a very shrewdness in animals, and how they hunt, and how they compete. But it's a mind that's driven by emotions. The mind is just there to satisfy the emotion, not the other way around. You can't reason with an animal. And the same thing with the animal soul on its own, without the divine soul. It's driven by impulse, but there's a seichel, what he calls a seichel hamelidon. And it's interesting, here he used the word hanechlek l'shalish. If you go back to chapter 2, to chapter 3, he says kolul. He says the expression koilel, that the seichel is not nechlek l'shalish, he says it's koilel chochma bina v'das. So Rabbi Levi Yitzhak, the Rebbe's father, explains, because in the midas of the nefesh habamis, it's nechlak, it's pirud. Everyone up for their own. It's selfish drives. In the divine soul, it's kolul, it's encompassing, which is like a form of agdus, iskalulus, not ischalkus. Like they say the expression, the Mittler Rebbe says, when two people come together, two Jews come together, it's like two divine souls against one animal soul. So the question is asked, what do you mean? It's two divine souls against two animal souls. Because ein adam chayte v'leilei. The animal soul is not interested in joining with someone else's desires. So animal souls don't unite unless it's completely self-interest. But each one is on their own. The divine souls are driven by bittul, so they unite. So therefore he uses the word nechlak, not koil. But it's interesting, he also uses the word das. Even though in some places it says in Klippa there's no das, explains the Rebbe Rashab, and he brings from the Kehelas Yankiv, that there's no das in the same way like he explained in chapter 3, das is kashrus, where a person binds themselves. It's a form of a union, an intimacy with, and that's what gives birth to those emotions in a real full sense of the word. That concept of das, of iskashrus like that, yes, a person can be consumed with a desire, so there is an element of it, but it's not quite the same das as it is in Kedusha. But there is das. So there you have 10 impure crowns, corresponding to the 10 holy spheres of the divine soul. So the animal soul, therefore, has that corresponding element. Then the Alter Rebbe is now going to continue and explain what does it mean and how the Moichen and Midas work in the animal soul. And he's going to say the Midas are connected to Seichel as well. That's why it's not just 7. It's not just 7 animal impulses. There is a mind at work. But that will leave for next week. So, we began chapter 6. These programs are all archived and saved. You can go to TanyaApply.com and find them all. And you can also submit any question that you like. Everyone have a good tavoch, and we will continue the journey next week. Be well.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApply.com for archived classes and more resources.